Math and trigonometry functions. Beginning with SUMIF and SUMIFS, two of probably the most useful, powerful functions in Excel. It allows you to sum a column of numbers in a reference to some other column values. Rand and rand between allows you to generate a random number. Rand between is a little bit more controlled than rand is. EXP allows you to take the exponent. The square root function takes the square root, positive square root of a number. The power function raises a number to a given power. And the fact function returns the factorial of a number. The product function multiplies its arguments, and the sum product function multiplies two data arrays. The sine function returns the sine of a number, and the ABS, or absolute value function, returns the absolute value of a given number, or in other words, makes a negative number positive. So math and trigonometry functions, beginning with SUMIF and SUMIFS, two of the most useful functions in the 350 functions that Excel offers. These two and the VLOOKUP can go a long way to you being able to build some robust functioning formulas. The VLOOKUP will pull out a discrete value. The SUMIF and SUMIFS will sum values in a column that meet certain criteria. So we're going to begin with the SUMIF, and I've got some data that hopefully will obviously display what the results should be, so you can see obviously what the SUMIF and SUMIFS are doing. SUMIF tab, the first argument is the range, and I'm going to select column O as the range. The criteria, I'm going to make the number 1, and the sum range is an optional argument, and I'll show you how to use that in a second. Entering, so the SUMIF returns 4 because it's summing or adding together all the cells to contain a value of 1. So we can look to a column or a range of data and sum together all the cells that contain values that match the criteria. So we can use the SUMIF function in a slightly different way. Putting a SUMIF function into cell B17, and when I build this function, this is the way I think of it. I want SUMIF to look in this range, column M, for this value, the letter A, and sum, this time we're going to define that optional argument, sum the corresponding value that's in column O. So I have 4 A's in column M. The corresponding value is 1 for each one of those A's. This should return a result of 3, and it is 3. And it seems like that the first argument is actually two completely different things. In the first case, we use the range to reference the range that we were going to pull the values from. In the second case, we use the range to be a reference for the criteria. And the net result is, if you don't define the optional argument sum range, the range argument is both the range that's looked to see if the criteria is a match, and it also is the range that is summed. If you establish a sum range, the range argument is the range that you're looking into to see if the criteria matches, and then in each instance, the corresponding value in the sum range is added to the total. So what does a SUMIFS do? The SUMIFS, I think, is one of the best functions in Excel. But what the SUMIFS allows you to do, tab that into the cell, is to first define a sum range, and for us the only range that could possibly be is the range that contains values, which is column O, or a portion of column O. I'm going to select the whole column. And then we can establish a series of criteria ranges and criteria. One pair of criteria range and criteria is required, because otherwise the SUMIFS wouldn't know what to look for and wouldn't know what values to sum. So the first criteria range is going to be column L, and the criteria is going to be the text string A1, and I'm going to establish some optional criterias. Column M is the criteria range 2, and I'm going to have it look for the letter A, comma, and criteria range 3 is going to be column N, and I'm going to have the criteria be the text string AA. So if I'm paying attention here to what I put into the cell, the answer should be 2, and it is. Because we asked the SUMIF function to look for A1 in column L, A in column M, and AA in column N. And the only records that correspond to those three criterias are those two listed at the top, and summing the values that's in column O, we get 2. Rand and rand between. Both of these functions return a random number. Rand is a volatile function and returns a random number between 0 and 1. And since it's a volatile function, there is 1, no arguments that are defined, and 2, it'll recalculate every time you recalculate the workbook. And the rand between function gives you a little bit more control over the random number that's generated. It also will recalculate every time you recalculate the workbook. So I'm going to select a range of cells and input a rand function. Tab, Control, Enter, and I get what's described. I get a random number that's between 0 and 1. And every time I recalculate the workbook, which I can force it to recalculate by inputting a value in a cell and entering, the rand function recalculates. The rand between, like I said, allows you a little bit more control. I'm going to select another range of cells, input the rand between, where you can define the bottom number, comma, and the top number. So the rand between function will generate a random number, in this case, between 100 and 200. Control Enter. And when I did that, you may have noticed that the rand function recalculated again. I'm going to go over a couple of cells. And the rand between function is also a volatile function, and it will recalculate every time the workbook recalculates, or the worksheet recalculates. Square root, power, and fact. These are pretty straightforward mathematical operations. The square root of a number is whatever number that multiplied by itself will generate that number. The square root function has one argument, which is a number, and it will return a value that when multiplied by itself will give you that number. So the easiest one to understand, and this is probably new for nobody, is the square root of 4, which is 2, because 2 times 2 equals 4. Power will raise a number to a given power. So let's raise 2 by a power of 4, enter, and it's 16. Because 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, that's 3 2's, times the 4th 2, 8 times 2, is 16. And fact gives you the factorial of a number, and if you remember back in statistics, the factorial of a number has to do with figuring out probabilities, and the factorial of any given number is that number times that number minus 1, times that number minus 2, times that number minus 3, and everything down to, but not including 0, because if you multiply it all by 0, you're going to end up with 0. So the factorial of 4 is 24, because 4 times 3 is 12, times 2 is 24, times 1 is still 24. The product and the sum product involve multiplication. The product function will multiply all of the arguments, which are either could be hard-coded numbers or they could be references to cells which contain values or numbers. And the sum product allows you to multiply 2 or more arrays. So the product function is sort of a no-brainer, but we're going to cover it for completeness purposes. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which should be 16. Enter, and of course it's 16. The sum product function is kind of interesting. It only has the requirement of defining one array. But how do you multiply one array? Well, if you define only one argument, the required argument, the sum product function multiplies that array by 1. Entering, it returns 40, and if I select all of those cells and look down at my status bar, the sum is 40. But it will also allow you to multiply, selecting that cell F2 and backing up one step with the left arrow, comma, one array and another array. In fact, you can continue to add arrays. So now what is the answer? Enter. It's 120. So obviously if the total sum of the first array of numbers is 40, the sum product function is not multiplying 40 times 40. because the sum of all the numbers in each of these arrays equals 40. So what is it doing? It is multiplying each value times the other array's corresponding value. Control Enter. And looking to the status bar once again, the total is 120. The last two functions that we're going to cover in this movie are the sine function and the absolute value function. I'm going to put a negative number in cell E16, negative 10, and then reference that cell using the sine function. And again, this is sort of a no-brainer. The sine is a negative 1, of course. And the absolute value of that number, tabbing that into the cell, is a positive 10. If I make that value a positive 10, the absolute value won't change what it returns, but the sign will, of course, change because now it's a positive number. So those are some fundamental math and trigonometry functions. We began by talking about the SUMIF and the SUMIFS functions. Again, I think two of the most powerful functions in Excel. The SUMIF function will allow you to add numbers in a range given a criteria that you establish, and the SUMIFS function will do the same thing with enabling you to establish multiple criteria. The rand and rand between will generate random numbers. The square root, power, and factorial will generate that result for a given number, either the square root, it'll take a number to a given power, or it'll take the factorial of a number. The product function will multiply all of its arguments. The sum product will multiply all of its arrays that are defined for each corresponding value in those arrays. The sine function will return the sign of a number, and the absolute value will return the absolute value or the positive value if it's a negative number.